Hey everybody, Smart Silver Stacker here. The Biden administration's decarbonization plans and the plans for a transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy, it's going to lead to higher prices for a lot of things, but specifically, it is going to put tremendous upward pressure on the price of copper. Now, I want to get into some of the numbers and some of the details, but before we do that, I just want to take a quick look at this fact sheet, which kind of gives us an overview of some of the plans to transition to renewables. So the first bullet point I want to look at here is that the Department of the Interior is going to be holding record-breaking offshore wind lease sales, and they're going to be trying to generate up to 7 gigawatts of clean energy in New York and New Jersey with offshore power generation. And we're going to talk more about offshore power generation in detail here in just a few minutes. Also, there's going to be plans to increase the amount of onshore power generation, and on public lands, they're going to be building 18 projects that are going to try to deliver 4.175 gigawatts of clean energy. The Department of Energy is launching a new Building a Better Grid initiative, and that's going to accelerate the deployment of new transmission lines. And those are primarily going to be built using copper, so that's going to lead to a lot of copper demand. The Department of Agriculture is going to have a pilot program to support clean energy being brought to underserved rural communities. So the way we can interpret that, I believe, is that the government is going to be subsidizing power projects that otherwise wouldn't make a lot of sense in the free market. And then finally, I want to take a look at this bullet point about financing transmission lines and other grid upgrades, because this gives us some clue as to how much all of this is going to cost. So there's going to be a $2.5 billion transmission facilitation program. There's going to be a $3 billion expansion for the Smart Grid Investment Grant Program. There will be more than $10 billion in grants for states, tribes, and utilities to enhance grid resilience. And then also there's this $3.25 billion Western Area Power Administration Transmission Infrastructure Program. Now that's a mouthful. And all of this alphabet soup, government spending, all of this is going to contribute to higher copper prices through inflation. And we'll get into that in just a few minutes. But first, before we talk about any of the reasons this is going to drive the price of copper higher, I want to draw your attention to this one specific program. Now, this is a headline from E&E News. It's an energy news service. And this story is about the Biden administration's plan to launch 16 offshore wind farms by 2030. And this is part of their broader decarbonization agenda. And this is just one project. You got to keep that in mind. But I want to dive into how much copper this program is going to need to come to completion. So the goal of this project is to generate 30 gigawatts of offshore wind power by 2030. And I want to take a look at some information here on copper.org. So according to this data here, onshore wind farms, they use about 7,766 pounds of copper per megawatt, but offshore wind installations, they use almost 3 times more at 21,068 pounds of copper per megawatt. And the additional copper is largely due to the cabling required for these offshore wind farms. So we can do a little math here with our calculator, and if these offshore wind farms that the Biden administration is planning on constructing by 2030, they're going to generate 30 gigawatts. Now, you multiply that by 1,000 to get the number of megawatts involved, and then we multiply that number by the 21,068 pound figure, and we can see that this program alone to build these offshore wind farms is going to consume about 632 million pounds of copper. And we're going to take a look at some data to put that into context. But first, I do just want to say a quick thank you to today's video sponsor, silverbotanicals.com, household and personal hygiene products that utilize the power of nano silver. Check them out with the link down in the description. And don't forget to use coupon code STACKER to save 10% on your order. Okay, so 632 million pounds of copper. How does that stack up, say, to the amount of copper that gets consumed every year in the United States? Well, in this data from Statista, we can see that last year, about 2 million metric tons of copper were consumed in the United States overall. So that's for everything that we use copper for. So if we go over to Google, we can convert our 632 million pounds of copper into metric tons, and you can see that we get a figure of about 286,000 metric tons. So when you compare that to the 2 million metric tons that we used last year, you can see that this project is going to consume more than 10% of the total amount of copper that the United States uses annually. And so it is a tremendous amount of this metal that is going to be needed to build these projects. And again, this is just one of several projects that the Biden administration and all of these alphabet soup agencies intend to put into place. And all of this is coming at a time that world copper stocks are dropping. So this is a chart of the LME copper inventories that they have in their warehouses. And you can see there is some seasonality to this chart, lots of ups and downs. But the overall trend here is that for the past decade, the world's stocks and supply of copper have been declining. And take a look at the price action that we've had in copper over the past couple of years, and you can see there was a big decline back in 2020 during that recession, but then we got this huge spike up to almost $5 a pound, which would be an all-time record price back in February and March of this year when Russia invaded Ukraine. That was the same time that we saw a big spike up in pretty much all commodities. And the price has come down since then, but it is starting to tick up now. You know, the price was coming down as the Fed was hiking rates and the US dollar index was strengthening, the dollar price of copper was falling. But now, one thing we're seeing is the dollar is kind of beginning to break down and the price of copper is rising again. Right now, it's about $3.80 per pound. So if we want to put into perspective how much the copper in this wind farm program is going to cost, all we need to do is take this number and multiply it by $3.80. And you can see it's almost $2.5 billion worth of copper at today's prices that would be needed to complete this one project of 16 offshore wind farms. And of course, as these projects begin to go into effect and more of these projects are completed, I think right now they've only built 2 of these wind farms, or only approved 2 of the wind farms, so they haven't even been constructed yet. So that copper has not been consumed yet. But as these projects go into effect, we're going to see the price of copper moving higher. And so, $2.5 billion is sort of like the floor on how much this copper is going to cost. And you also got to keep in mind, this is just the copper cost. This has nothing to do with the manufacturing, the labor, the other materials, none of that. This is just the raw material cost of copper alone for these wind farms. Now, also, I'm going to take a look at the longer term price chart for copper here, and you can see that the overall trend has been a move much higher over the past several decades, and that is a trend that is likely to continue. Now, one thing I think some people out there might think is maybe there are some alternatives to copper that they could use if the price of copper goes too high. That's one thing that happens in markets. The price of one material goes up too much. And, manufacturers, builders, they'll look for cheaper alternatives. But there aren't a lot of alternatives to copper. One alternative that there is, though, is silver. So you can use silver brushes in some of these motors. Now, you still need copper for the transmission lines and all that. This is an article from windpowerengineering.com about how silver brushes in these motors are actually a better choice for longevity and lifetime performance, and how they don't require as much long-term maintenance as copper components. So as far as substitutions for copper goes, one of the big ones might be silver, but of course, silver is probably not getting any cheaper anytime soon either. And so, this could also be pretty bullish for the silver market. Now, I just want to talk about 3 reasons that these programs are going to drive the price of copper much higher. The first one is pretty obvious. There's more demand for copper. So, the demand for copper is going to go up, and quite a bit, because like I said, this is just one of the programs, these wind farms, and I've already demonstrated that's going to take a tremendous amount of copper. When you factor in all the solar, geothermal projects and all these transmission lines that they're going to be building, the demand for copper is going to be absolutely tremendous. And so, unless the supply can expand in a big way to compensate for that, the price is going to have to go higher. The second reason is that this transition away from cheap fossil fuels to more expensive renewables is going to drive the overall cost of energy up. And mining, refining, and recycling copper, those are all very energy intensive activities. Remember, energy is a global market. So as energy becomes more expensive because of this transition to renewables, you're going to see the input cost for making copper rise in a commensurate way. If you see the cost of producing copper move up a lot because of higher input costs, the price of copper itself is going to have to move up to compensate for that. And then the third reason is inflation, because all of this, we already talked about the tens of billions of dollars that the government is disclosing right now in grants and tax cuts and subsidies to finance this shift away from fossil fuels into a renewable power grid. All of that is being financed by the printing press. I mean, the government is broke. They don't have any money for these projects, and so they're going to pay for it the way they pay for all of this extra spending. That's just by borrowing this money into existence, using the printing press and expanding the supply of money, which is going to exert an upward inflationary pressure on the prices of all commodities, including copper and silver. It's going to make the energy costs go even higher, so that also in turn is going to lead to higher copper prices. And really, this is just a perfect storm for the price of copper specifically to be moving much higher. Now, I did a video just a couple days ago about some of the ways that you can stack physical copper and also some ways that you can do it well below the current spot price. So I think this is a big opportunity for stackers that we should all be paying attention to. And also, there's copper miners, there's other ways you can get exposure to this. And none of this is financial advice. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just kind of sharing some information with you. Make sure you're doing your own due diligence. And on that note, leave me a comment down below to let me know what you think about this transition to renewable energy. I mean, I'm kind of skeptical of it myself. I think it's going to lead to much higher prices for energy, a reduced standard of living, but I would like to know what you have to say. So leave me a comment down below to let me know what you think. And I do just want to say a big thank you to all of you for watching today. Thank you very much for tuning in. Stay safe and happy stacking, and I'll catch you next time. Smart Silver Stacker, out.